Hello, in this lesson we're going to talk about securing Windows, more particularly on security threats and countermeasures in Windows. So let's get started. Here we go. We'll click on the slides and I'm going to hit present. So the whole point of this lesson is to kind of give you an idea of what the current security landscape is looking like. Obviously, this is not going to be comprehensive. There's whole courses dedicated, multiple courses dedicated on this subject matter. But kind of just to get your feet wet and to better understand some things that Windows can do. So first of all, let's talk about malware. In general, security experts try to classify malware with circulation, infection, concealment, payload as characteristics. So we're going to work our way through some kind of common phrases, and each one of these phrases, each one of these tend to indicate one, if not a couple of these different categories. So case in point, like a Trojan horse. A Trojan horse is talking about how it circulates and how it infects. But it doesn't necessarily talk about if a virus is a Trojan horse or a piece of malware is a Trojan horse. It's not really going to talk about how it tries to conceal itself if it doesn't detry, or what the payload is, what the damage is, right? So just keep that in mind. In my mind, circulation infection is all one, but officially there's 4 different characteristics. So let's talk about them, all right? Circulation, what we're talking about is this right here, this in-between stage, right? So we have some kind of device, right? An operating system running over here, right? We have an operating system running over here, okay? The circulation is the method of transit from one operating system to another operating system, okay? So that's circulation, all right? The other question is infection, right? Because there's one thing to be said. In this case, this guy's already infected. It's trying to automatically infect, which would make this a worm if it's doing it by itself. But anyway, we'll talk about that. But infection is how it's actually going to break in through the security of the operating system, right? That point of getting in and installing itself into the operating system is the infection, okay? The type of infection. Concealment deals with how we have a piece of malware installed in an operating system, how we're actually going to conceal that that malware within the operating system, so the user can't see it, or the operating system or anti-malware software, right? And finally, payload. Payload deals with what kind of damage is it going to do. Is it a ransomware? Will actually encrypt files and send you and notify its central control structure to send you an email to let you know that your files have been encrypted and that you need to pay someone money in order to keep those files, right? That's an example, ransomware, right? So it's actually, when we're talking about payload, we're talking about what damage it does, right? In the case of bots, it turns your computer into a node in a large bot army or something along those lines, right? That's what we're talking about for payload. Okay, so that being said, let's talk about the actual individuals. All right, so we have Trojan horse. A Trojan horse essentially it's malware that either hides in legitimate software or pretends it is legitimate and useful software, so that the user can actually install it. Hence the term Trojan horse, like the Trojan War. The Greeks built a giant horse as a present to the Trojans, saying that, believing they pretending like they gave up on the war and they all went home. The Trojans take it in. It turns out it's full of Greek soldiers, and they open up the gates, and the rest of the army can come in and sack the city. So that's where we get the term Trojan horse, right? Trojan horse, essentially, we think it's something useful. We download it, we install it. So that in a way you're kind of dealing with infection there as well. So it's circulation, we download it. Infection, we install it, right? Now It can, again, this doesn't make it not a Trojan horse, and it is a Trojan horse, but it actually can run a actual piece of software we think we like, right? Uh, Tom the Cat, for example, right? Old piece of software, showing my age, but it's an old piece of software that ran, and it's it presented a cat that did funny things or whatever. I don't know why users liked it, but so it was something they thought they wanted, but in the background, it was actually a piece of spyware. Right, the payload was it was recording your actions and recording what you were doing, and so that was the actual payload, right? So that's again, because Trojan horse isn't if it's a Trojan horse piece of malware, it's not concerned about the concealment payload. What we're concerned about is the actual circulation infection. It's a Trojan horse, right? It disguised itself as useful software. Next one is a virus. A virus is going to essentially need user interaction in order to. The user has to kick off the infection, okay, and for circulation, right? So a good example of a virus is like a PHP script that installs something on your computer. A small little, it could be a little, little small program that's purpose is to install a much larger virus. But the fact that the user has to visit the website, right, and run that PHP script, right, that's what makes it a virus, right? It's circulation and infection. It's going to need user interaction to do something, okay? As compared to a worm. A worm doesn't need user interaction. What it does is once it infects a node on your network, it's going to go out and scan for vulnerability, right? It's going to send out a port scan or something, right? It's going to scan around looking for another machine. And when it sees a machine with a certain vulnerability it can use, it's going to go, oh, okay, I can use that. And it's going to go after it, and it's going to replicate itself here. And then that machine starts scanning out looking for more machines, okay? That's what a worm is. Now, that might seem like it's more powerful because it's replicating itself, and in some regards it is. But what happens is particularly if the vulnerability is too prevalent, and you have to figure if you're attacking a corporate network, if one machine's vulnerable to the exploit, then pretty much all the all the like machines are going to be also vulnerable to the exploit. And this action of scanning, a lot of modern day devices like intrusion detection and intrusion prevention, hardware and software, those devices, they could either be a device or they could be software running on a server, will actually pick up the actual scanning, and therefore it will alert the administrator that something seriously wrong is going wrong. So usually worms are less powerful now due to concealment issues, right? I mean, in a theory, you could write a worm that was kind of sneaky about it, a little bit more sneaky. But again, it's hard to control how it spreads. So you're seeing a little less and less of worms, but maybe they'll be coming back now that we can write them with a little bit more constraint, perhaps. All right. But originally worms were really popular in the 90s, particularly when we had early Windows operating systems, 98, 95, that were really susceptible, had a lot of vulnerabilities, no firewall. Though usually what a worm would do is bring down your network. The payload itself was the whole spreading of the device, right? That was the payload. It would spread so quickly and it would eat up all your network bandwidth and slow down your network. So we're not seeing a whole lot of worms. Perhaps in the future we will, with maybe a more impressive payload like crypto mining or Bitcoin mining, right? Which we don't really talk about, which we'll talk about. I think remind me via your computer to talk about crypto mining. I'll talk about it once we talk about ransomware. All right, so that's a worm. Rootkit virus. Rootkit viruses essentially are referring to the concealment. Okay, so rootkit is concerned about concealment. All right, remember an operating system at the end of the day is, and this is going to be way oversimplified, but that's a good thing. They'll help us understand it, right? I'm not here to teach you how to write viruses. I'm here to tell you how they work, okay? So we got our processor, right? We have our processor. We got our memory, right? And we got our storage. Okay. Now remember, sorry, HD. I was already thinking of rootkit. So remember, there's part of the operating system, or the part of the memory where the operating system functions, and it's guarded, right? In the case of Windows, we have this thing called DEP that actually protects the operating system. That's short for data execution prevention. Anyway, so what that does, and more so the kernel mode and the fact that we have a kernel mode in our operating system, what that does is it helps try to protect this vulnerable area. Well, I wouldn't say vulnerable, but this part of the memory that's used for operating system. Because if a virus is able to get in here, it's going to be harder, particularly for the kernel, the fact we have a kernel mode and it is so well protected, for an antivirus to actually scan for that device. So if we can get, and usually when you get in there, a couple things you're going to do. You're going to try to scout around the rest of this memory, right, using primarily machine code. And you're going to hop around and you're going to try to figure out different parts, do different reads of the memory and try to figure something out in the operating system or something running in kernel mode. Maybe if you can actually, anyway. You're going to get a little kernel in there, a little foothold. And once you get in that foothold, you can do other things, like go into memory and install a bigger program, right? Or in the hard drive, remember in the hard drive we had a special part of the platter, or any special part is certain sectors marked off as the boot sector, right? That boot sector, again, is deep in the operating system, and it tends to be difficult to format. So if you do format your entire hard drive, and B, to do some scanning, some antivirus scanning or anti-malware scanning, right? So long story short, rootkits install themselves so deep in the operating system that they're hard to A, detect, and B, if you do detect them, they're really hard to delete, okay? Case in point, if you're in the boot sector and you don't format that boot sector, that little kernel of the operating system, or a little kernel of a program that gets loaded up when you boot up your operating system, can actually reinstall the virus from scratch, even though you got rid of it, okay? So that's a rootkit, all right? So next are bots. Just know this, that there are viruses. There's also worms, but pretty much mainly viruses, and a lot of them are Trojan horse. That what they do is they collect operating systems, right? They collect end nodes, and nowadays it's not just Windows; it's IoT devices. It's your cameras, it's your TVs, DVD players, anything that has an operating system in it, anything that communicates on the network is susceptible to become a bot. Okay, and what happens is if you collect enough bots, you could do a bunch of cool things. You can make money by going off and simulating page views. People get paid for that, right? They can go out and hit a page, and then you can pretend your web page is far more popular than it really is. That type of thing. Traditionally, what they've been used for is DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. And what they do is they kind of hit one target. If you get a bunch of them, they can hit one target, and that one target will be so busy servicing garbage traffic that it won't have time to service legitimate traffic, right? So a bot, essentially what happens is it's a normal PC or IoT, Internet of Things device, camera, that kind of thing, that has a bit of malware on there that allows from a command and control structure. So that's my cloud, but that somewhere out in the internet, there's a command and control structure, and that's able to send commands to these bots, right? And when it sends commands to those bots, the bots then execute an attack or load up pages or something, whatever they're supposed to do, generate clicks. Okay, next we have spyware. Spyware is referring to, by the way, bots is the payload. Okay, that's what it does, right? So it doesn't necessarily refer to what type of circulation, infection, or even concealment, although you'd want pretty good concealment with a bot. What it's actually doing is referring to the payload. All right, next we're going to talk about spyware, which is also talking about payload. A device that's, malware that's spyware is going to just keep track of what you're doing for various nefarious purposes. Anything from as mundane as getting in the economy of surveillance, as they like to call it, like Facebook and Google, just seeing what web pages you go to, that type of stuff, and selling it to advertisers, which is, for some, obviously it's not benign, but it's almost an accepted price of business on the internet nowadays. Anyway, all the way to being a little bit more nefarious, like recording your keyboard strokes. That way they can kind of figure out your password, right? You type into your keyboard a lot, your password, right? So spyware can have a number of things, but we're talking about payload. Okay, so yes, you can have virus that's a spyware, right? You can have a Trojan horse that's spyware, right? You can have a worm that's spyware. You could have a rootkit spyware, right? Well, that's actually probably the best type of spyware, right? Because rootkit is referring to concealment, right? And furthermore, you could have a virus, right? It's because we're talking about circulation and infection, right? You can have a virus that's a rootkit virus that's also spyware, right? So again, these aren't separate items, right? Armored is referring to concealment. It's just another technique we can do to hide our malware. If we have armored malware, essentially what we're doing is we're wrapping the malware code in another code. Okay, so case in point, Notepad.exe, which we've done in one of my other classes. We created malware that was in Notepad for Windows boxes using MS Venom, which it's nothing too fancy. I can teach in an afternoon, right? Nor is it that powerful, but just to get the concept, right? So I could take Notepad.exe, which is its own program, right, and then wrap in within that program, wrap in my malware, okay, and running separately. Okay, and that's kind of armored, right? And that way we're trying to fool any malware detectors, okay? Because hopefully they'll just see the Notepad.exe. Another thing we can do is a couple other things. We can Swiss cheese the code, so I can put the malware in different parts. I can also put benign code in the middle of my malware. I can encrypt my malware, so it's actually encrypted. It decrypts itself as it runs and re-encrypts itself as it stores itself. Again, making it more difficult to detect what any malware scares. And also we can change the code, Morpheus. We can change the code every time it executes. So we just kind of rearrange the functions, put it in different order, instead of using, ifs, use while loops, whatever, something just enough to make it look like different code. So if it's constantly changing, it makes it much more difficult for anti-malware software to detect it. So the last one here, last two, right? Because we're going to talk about ransomware, which is a payload. Okay, ransomware essentially goes out and encrypts files, right? The program's written to go out and usually encrypts what it thinks would be important files, like Access databases, Oracle databases, documents, Excel sheets. Those are really popular to encrypt. And then what's going to do is then notify you either by having a pop-up window or going out and notifying its command and control structure to then notify you as the user or the municipality, in the case of Atlanta, or various hospitals. As I was just reading an article yesterday about a hospital that had to pay something like $50,000 to get their stuff decrypted. So anyway, essentially you'll get a piece of, you'll get an email or you get something that says, please, your important files have been encrypted. It is a very powerful form of encryption. It'd be really difficult to recover, and a lot of time, to the point where your business would probably be out of business. And then the tricky part, and what makes these hackers truly professionals, most of the time these hackers are in it for the money, obviously. But what makes them truly professional, if they, which is funny because it was called the Sam group that did Atlanta. What caught the experts' eyes, the FBI's eyes, and said, these guys are good, is the fact they were able to set a very smart price. Right? It was enough that it hurt the city of Atlanta, so the city of Atlanta didn't do it, and it took a very long time to recover. But it's not enough to sit there and say, well, we could never afford that. The classic $1 billion Dr. Evil thing, right? Anyway, so that's what ransomware does. The other thing we want to talk about is crypto mining or Bitcoin mining, whatever you want to call it. What that's going to do, again, that's referring to payload. It's going to be a piece of software. And again, how it circulates, how it infects, how it conceals itself is irrelevant. It's just a piece of software. Hopefully, it does conceal itself well, because in order for this to work. But what it's going to do is essentially going to use the processor, when it's not busy, for your own processor, when it's not busy doing your stuff, like you're not actively watching a cat video, you're kind of off working on something else, or if you're just doing something like reading a Word document, your processor is not very busy. So what the attacker does is actually steal some of those processor clicks to work on, and we're not going to have time for me to explain Bitcoin, and not that I truly understand it myself, but essentially, Bitcoin, if you're able to hash the blockchain, if I'm not mistaken, you're able to submit that hashed Bitcoin, the hashed blockchain, and potentially be issued out a part of a Bitcoin. All right, so there's money to be made. It's part of the inflation process, because you have money, as we understand it, has to have inflation. So Bitcoin, what it does is it makes you encrypt the blockchain to apply and apply to a which is a very large file. And it gets larger as there's more Bitcoins and more transactions. So therefore, you're eating up more processor clicks. So technically, there's more and more value added to Bitcoin. Anyway, there's a way to make money by by hashing the blockchain. You may get issued part of a Bitcoin. So nefarious people are stealing people's processor clicks in the background. Hopefully it's much in the background, because obviously the whole point here is to stay concealed so they can continue to do the work and get the money. Although I just recently read an article where they said that's old hat now. There's new hotness out there. Anyway, so, but that's crypto mining. So ransomware and crypto mining are very much in the news as of late. They're both ways to make money with malware. So once you add money into it, now it's not just for lols, it's actually for cash, right? All right, so those are some different forms of malware. At least that's what I want to cover now, at least in Windows class. So let's talk about some other vulnerabilities. I shouldn't clap in front of the microphone. Sorry about that. So we have different vulnerabilities. Our software can introduce vulnerabilities. That's why we had the kernel mode and user mode, right? The software, we try to make it run in user mode. That way it protects the operating system. However, the operating system itself might have vulnerabilities. Buffer overflow refers to the process of eating up more and more memory, or just grabbing a little bit more memory, or changing integers to integers that aren't covered by the type of variable you defined, to the point where you're actually eating up a different part of memory you're not supposed to be in. Right? That could cause, at the very basic level, it can cause the whole operating system to crash, or a program to crash. At a more complex level, if you can sneak into parts of memory, you can kind of use it and not crash the system. You can use it to spy on what's going on in memory, right? Again, memory is kind of the working table for the operating system, right? So if I'm trying to, spy on a craftsman as they make something, it could be valuable information if I can just take a look at their working table, right? Maybe I can't actually see them do what they're doing, but if I see what tools they're using, then that could be valuable information, right? Privilege escalation is any kind of attack you have in which you essentially execute commands or instructions you're not supposed to be able to execute. So if you're in as a common user and you are able to, we haven't talked about the tokens, but execute a second token to run like this part, and something we have already talked about, and then able to partition a drive or create a separate partition. That's a privilege escalation attack, right? Whenever you escalate your privilege to a level you're not supposed to have, that's a privilege escalation attack. Of course, applications can offer their own vulnerabilities. So we'll talk about that with attack surface. Attack surface services are a very popular thing. If I can get into a service, right? A service is a piece of software that runs in the background. It's meant for continual operation, usually in the background. So it's meant to run kind of low and slow, and stable in the background, right? So we have some countermeasures for that. What we can do is we can patch both our software. It's important to patch our software, but more importantly, our operating system. We'll talk about that a little bit. Reduce our attack surface, right? The other day in class, we were in my networking class, we were running a port scanner, and I saw another workstation on our network. It wasn't anyone in my class, I don't think, but someone on the network was running IIS, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, why do you have IIS running, right? That's a good example. Like you've increased your attack surface, and they had port 80 open, right? So they've increased their attack surface, right? If I look at an operating system as kind of a walled-off medieval city, which I like to often equate this to, right? My attack surface is anywhere where there might be a vulnerability, right? So again, if I create a door, and I'll sit there and say, well, yeah, I created a door, but I put a nice strong gate in there. It doesn't matter. That's now increased. This has now increased my attack surface, right? Before, when there's a nice solid wall that I'd have to either scale or knock down, now there's a gate, right? There's something I can actually take advantage of. I can actually assault, right? I can take a battering ram to. Okay, so now I have to put up defenses around that, which is fine. But the point is, I should ask myself at the beginning, like, do I really need this service, right? So if I'm on an operating system and I'm goofing off and I'm playing around and I open up a telnet service, right? I'm trying to telnet into my own machine. And I don't close that firewall hole down. What I've done is I've increased my attack surface, right? So now it's just another possible vulnerability. I'm not saying it's a guaranteed vulnerability. You're definitely going to get hacked there. My point is this, though. I now have a part of I've just now increased the potential for vulnerabilities. That's attack surface, okay? What we can do is restrict our network access too if we have vital information. Believe me, the city of Atlanta wishes they took some of their critical databases and files offline. That's really, we talk about backing up there too. But network access, reducing the network access, or as we call it in the industry, air gapping, because you often unplug it from the wall. So we have an air gap now, right? So another vulnerability is social engineering. We don't have time to get into the finities of social engineering, but basically, establish your authority, create some empathy, create an emergency, and then ask, as they call it in the industry, right? So I could sit there for months and months and months and months and months and try to figure out your password, or I could just call you up and ask you for it, right? You'd be surprised how effective that is, as long as I can manipulate you enough. But humans are vulnerable to manipulation, so try not to blame the user. All right. All right. So that's the lazy way to blame the user. All right. You got to train the user. All right. So some other countermeasures. We have anti-malware, Windows Defender, and other software. So Windows Defender, as it looks today, I'm going to bring this over. They've been constantly playing with it, and sorry about that. I was doing a resolution. I was changing the resolution around. So here's Windows Defender. It says actions required. As it's called now, Windows Defender security area. Set up OneDrive. Okay, sure. Sign into Microsoft for enhanced security. Sure. So anyway, as you can see, we can scan for antivirus right here. We can check our protections. Now, the way this works essentially is any not any anti-malware. We'll talk about holistic and spot scanning. The way spot scanning works is it uses signatures. Okay. Now, what happens is essentially the signatures is essentially bits of code, right? It's binary, hexadecimal, whatever it is. It's lines of code, right? And there's a big list, right? As we're probably all familiar, there's going to be a big list of these signatures. And what happens is spot scanning anti-malware, which Defender utilizes, will go around and look at file by file by file by file, right? In memory, look at lines of code, lines of code, lines of code. And it's going to detect whether or not it matches any of these signatures. If it matches a signature, every signature is going to have a name to it, right? So we could have Win32, W32. Whoop. It's getting more. Once my memory fills up, this gets difficult to write with. Win32, Trojan Horse, right? I'm not going to write the whole thing out, but say Trojan horse, and then have a fun name, like a thingy, whatever, right? So we do a thing, right? So the point is, it's going to have this name to it, all right? So Win32 usually tells you what the programming structure is, how it was written. Trojan horse will talk about, you know, some aspect of the device, and then the thing will personalize it. But the point is, that's how it knows, right? It says, oh, it matches line of code. That line of code is Win32 Trojan horse thingy, right? So that's spot scanning. Holistic, what the holistic does is it takes it to the operating system and it looks at the operating system and all the processes in the operating system and how they interact, right? And if it sees anything odd, like, you know, they see a piece of software that keeps accessing scanning memory or something like that, that looks a little odd. Why is that doing that, right? It looks for suspicious behavior, right? Now, the problem with holistic scanning is, it has to know what normal looks like, right? And again, we're all kind of biased on what normal is, right? So what you end up with is a lot of false positives and false negatives. Well, more so the false positives, right? And so what they end up having to do is dial in the false positives and the false negatives, right? Until you get this cross somewhere in the middle where there's enough, there's not a balance between false positives and false negatives, right? You're going to end up with a lot of so the thing is, if I see that line of code, if it says it's this w132.trojanhorse.thingy, I could be 99% sure that is indeed it, because that signature in there should only show up in a virus. Right now, it comes down to the person who wrote the signature, but they have professionals, and you know, there's someone actually checking that and making sure it should only hit on that, right? As compared to the holistic, is essentially a piece of software has decided another piece of software is running odd, right? So what's odd, what's not odd, right? So we end up with false positives, false negatives, more so with holistic. All right. Some other things we could do is patch. We got to patch our machines. So let's talk about patch management. We have a MSUS, all right, server, Microsoft Update Server. Update service. Okay, what that does now, so in the good old days, and they weren't that good, we'd have a lot of nodes running on our network, right? And what would happen is here's my cloud, by the way. It's a little bumpy. All right, so what's going to happen is if they had to download something from Microsoft, they would all hit individual download sessions, downloading the updates. Plus, as an admin, I didn't have a whole lot of control over it. I could pester my users to tell them to download it, but at the end of the day, they were in a little bit more control than I probably would like. So anyway, if I have an MSUS server, what I can do is download it and instead have all these clients hit my MSUS. And look to the MSUS. They would never go out to the internet and look at Microsoft. There's a setting in the registry to change this. Okay, particularly really easy to do in a domain setting. So anyway, I have an MSUS server. It downloads, so I only have one download. I'm saving myself a bunch of bandwidth, right? And this MSUS server will then push down updates. The cool thing is I can control that as an admin, so I could test out patches before I push them out. Yeah, it's good to push out patches as soon as possible, but I want to test it to make sure it's not going to break any of my business critical software and get anyone fired, right? So MSUS is an important tool in that regard. And then we have policies as well. One policy we're going to play with in this lab is, or soon coming up, I think actually, is we're going to play with password policy. We can make our passwords more complex, have a bigger history, that type of thing. Password policy, we have other policies as well, like when it comes to Windows, good acceptable use policies. You're not supposed to install software. Least permissive policy, where we don't give out users admin accounts. That's a good policy, right? So we can have different policies. All right. So firewalls in general. Let's talk about how firewalls work. So firewalls in general have there's three profiles of Windows firewall. There's private, public, and domain. All right. Private firewall. So the private network and the public network. Private's meant for a place like your house where you might want to run Microsoft sharing, which we'll talk about a little bit, or we want to share something out. We want to be able to make ourselves a little bit more scannable, so we may have more holes in the firewall. Public is for when you're out like in a cafe, and the domain is a secret one that only when you join the domain that you don't even know about. They don't tell you about it, but they make a third profile called domain. That's going to open up some holes so the domain controller can take over your machine. When you join the domain, you belong to another. You belong to another to the administrator. Okay. So there's going to be we're going to play with this in the lab, but there's utilities to edit the rules. Also, another important concept is Microsoft's firewall is adaptive security algorithm, right? So what's going to happen essentially is we're going to have an inside, which is your operating system itself. There you go. It took. Hold on. We're going to have an inside, and we're going to have an outside. All right? And what's going to happen is when traffic comes from the inside to the outside, it will let it through. Okay? And then it will expect return. So if you go out to Google and say, hey, I'm doing an HTTP request on Google, the firewall will expect when Google comes back and says, hey, I got a return traffic for you, it's a web page, to let you back in. Okay, as compared to like if we have a malicious person out here who wants to come into your operating system and see a web page or do a telnet session, you didn't initiate the conversation, so it gets blocked. Okay, so it creates these temporary holes to expecting return traffic. All right, that's the adaptive security part. So again, in private industry, we do see a little bit of a debate, or actually we saw a debate, whether or not to enable or disable our firewalls. However, the fact that we want layers of defense, perimeters upon perimeters inside perimeters, defending our network is winning the day, and we're seeing the firewall left enabled in more and more areas. So we kind of talked about denial of service. So a target is a service. So if my payload is just to take things down, my job is a lot easier as an attacker. So we have denial of service. We have distributed denial of service, which we talked about. Data. So we have data at rest versus data in transit. So data at rest means we're going to attack data that's in storage, right? Data in transit, something we're going to get that might be transiting between storage and memory, or more likely on the network. Okay, but we're going to attack. There's two types of data we can attack. We attack data in storage. We can attack data that's in transit, right? And just because it's within the operating system, it still could be in transit. Case in point, there is a vulnerability for BitLocker with SSD drives because that process of moving it from an SSD drive into the bus, it's unencrypted, and there is a way to kind of stick a piece of malware can kind of dip in and see that, right? So that's data kind of in transit. It's moving from one state to another state. Okay, let's quickly talk about encryption. We have synchronous, asynchronous, or hash. Synchronous means we're going to use the same key to encrypt data, right? So synchronous, we're going to use, a key, which is a piece of data, right? So here we go. We're going to have an algorithm. Right, so we have an algorithm, right? And what we're going to do is if we use just an algorithm, we didn't use a key, it'd be really easy to decrypt data, right? Because essentially there's no variable in the mix, right? As long as I figured out your algorithm, which is extremely easy to do, I would be able to figure out, so we're going to have plain text, right? And we're going to have encrypted text, okay? So what's going to happen is this key is going to come in and add a vulnerability in, okay? So what happens is if we use the same key to encrypt and decrypt, that's synchronous. Asynchronous key, is going to use, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to break that off I'm going to break off the encryption into a separate talk, and that will be listed on the website. So look below this one for a quick discussion on asynchronous versus synchronous versus hash encryption. So real quick, let's talk about some different features in Windows. We have BitLocker. So again, I talked about the kind of data in transit. We have on the motherboard, we have a TPM chip. A TPM chip, point is to generate keys to do some encryption and decryption and to store keys. So it's a special chip on the motherboard. What this does with BitLocker is it's going to encrypt the entire hard drive, and that key is going to be kept on the TPM chip. So it's not going to be put anywhere on the hard drive. So if someone takes the hard drive off the machine and plugs it into a different motherboard, which is a popular technique used to get data that's at rest, the problem is that TPM chip got left behind on the other motherboard. Okay, so essentially that's what it's going to do. You can also back up that key. If you back up that key, it's going to make an asynchronous key. But in general, BitLocker is going to use synchronous because it's much, much quicker. All right. So we have VPNs. A VPN creates a tunnel. What it does is it's going to be node to node. All right. I'll actually erase this to try to save on some memory. We're going to have a node to node. Okay. And what's going to happen is a VPN is any data set that's going to or coming in from this node is going to be encrypted, right? So this becomes encrypted. Now, a lot of people confuse it with private VPNs because private VPNs will go out and they'll confuse it with proxy. So if you do pay for a VPN service, what's going to happen is you're going to go VPN into their network, and then they're going to be a third party to set in your internet traffic and put it down this hole. But like in a business world, what we'll often do is we'll have a VPN between point to point, and any data going from point A to point B is going to be encrypted. Well, if I go out anywhere else on the internet, it won't be encrypted. All right. And then we have backups. So a simple rule of backups is 3-2-1. We're going to keep 3 copies, 2 of them local on different media. So maybe one on the disk, one on the thumb drive, and one that's far away from you. Maybe out the cloud, but if you're not a trusting type person, you could have another copy ideally far away from you, not in your house. So that way those 3 pieces of data can't be all running at the same time on the same network, right? Again, protecting you from ransomware. So Windows has native backup programs like the turning back the clock thing, which doesn't get used in the private industry a lot, so we're not going to cover it a whole lot. Anyway, so there you go. That's different things, different targets we can do, and protections. So there are different types of malware classified based off their circulation, payload, infection, and concealment. Attackers can target data or service. We can use VPNs, firewalls, anti-malware, BitLocker, patches, and policy. So there you go. Look for the other encryption talk to go along with this one. Thank you. Bye.